I'm Jack. My mission is to kill chaos.
Hello, War of the Visions fans. I'm Jackie Fox, and recently Ready Player Well released a very interesting video, kind of guide to the elements of randomness in War of the Visions, while also making the point generally that there was a lot more randomness lately, and that these elements of randomness were also increasing. The predictability of the game, which is something that is particularly important for content creators like himself and me, who more often look at the data and try to come up with character evaluations based on some sort of empirical idea of how this character will do in general situations. So for me, chaos, especially within this game, breaks down into two things that are actually pretty similar, but I think should be discussed separately. The actual randomness side of this is actually one of the more common ways it's being used right now. And even if you crunch all of the complexity about a fight, throwing in randomness just itself makes it harder to predict. So with status effects, they're inherently random, but they're also affected inherently by complexity. Because A, you could raise your status resistances, and because any character through the Trust Rune system can get a 25% resistance to any status, including Curse. Go, try it out. It's in there now. And this is without mentioning, there's like auras that can cancel out statuses for allies. There are ways of buffing status resistance. There are TMRs that are accessories that anyone can equip that can boost your status resistances to certain statuses. If you strip all of that away, there's still kind of a set percentage chance of it happening. So while you can't predict how it will change the outcome of an individual fight, you can say that in maybe 10 or 15 fights, it will do a certain thing in 6 of them. Actually, probably more, since your counters since you may have multiple chances to cast these statuses. I mean, it's usually a lot higher with counters because you're potentially taking damage within range multiple times in a fight. One of the things that's really changed lately, and again, there have been characters that have been able to do this for a while, although I think in certain cases it was locked to limit bursts quite smartly. But a lot more recently, we've been getting large area effect that does all sorts of certain statuses. Like, we're seeing a lot of poison now. We had a phase where there was a lot of slow. We are kind of on the end of a phase where there was just a ton of sleep. AoE confusion has been a thing a number of times. AoE Paralyze is actually kind of old, and again, another reason to bring up Skahal in this video series. That was on his LB. And I think that especially with these statuses, but even worse, like recently there have been a number of characters where the amount of chance to proc your status actually increases and kind of becomes less random, but still random. But more likely to happen, more consistent at the very least, with more people in the AoE, which is dynamic in that it's affected by how many people are standing in a given place and if you can reach them. So status itself is a wild topic, but I want to focus in on a number of statuses specifically that add a lot of complexity, because there's the thing that they do most of the time and the randomness of whether or not they do it, but there's also a lot of side effects to statuses that we don't actually talk about with them. And when those side effects line up in the right scenarios, they can actually be more important than the status effect itself. And pretty much everything that I've mentioned has been a good example of this so far. For instance, my 2 favorite examples of this are poison and slow. So for both of these effects, let's say, and I'm getting this off the slow effect for Veritas of the Earth, this may actually be higher than standard, but 50% slow. That's pretty rough to be hit with, right? But if you have haste in effect, you're getting a 42% speed increase. You go from 142% speed down to 50. That's a decrease of over 60%, going on 70, which is massive. Now, thankfully, like, equipment stats and maybe your trust runes are kind of immune to this. They're outside of this calculation, which is kind of good in this case, as they give you a bit of a safe baseline, but at the same time they don't get boosted by haste, so they're also kind of bad in other scenarios. So you're not going to lose like all of your speed, but if this specific scenario happens to you, you're probably going to go from the fastest or one of the fastest things onto the field to almost definitely the slowest. And we've seen a lot of different characters that have been able to get, especially like offensive DPSs, or maybe more evasive type characters. We've seen a lot more like time mage veined characters that can do maybe multiple hastes. So haste is all over the place, but like specifically Ashramont's LB, also looking at Perrine's LB, there's also a lot of LBs that give haste, in addition to a lot of TMRs that give haste, which are becoming like standard to run. So in this environment where everybody is thinking of haste as the default, it becomes really good to be running slow, because not only are you getting the chance to slow, which itself is great, but you're also getting the chance to dispel haste, which in itself is also great. Getting both of these things at the same time means in a specific scenario, which, I mean, until recently in WotV was pretty unlikely to line up, is now more consistently causing a bigger tempo swing in the fight. The same is true for Regen and Poison. Poison has been for a long time a status effect that people didn't really concern themselves with. I think the only characters that really concern themselves with poison resistance traditionally are units that use courage, because that extra damage proccing off can invalidate your courage if it's your last HP. So now there's a whole new class of character that has to worry about poison resistance, and that's technically everybody, because you have units like Shalza, who are supports, that can give both of their partners regen at the same time, in addition to a number of tanks or other types of units like Dialdo, who gets regen as part of his LB. So these units, much like you consistently expect Mont to have haste, you would consistently expect Dialdo to be able to get regen. Therefore, the value in taking away their plus 10% HP per turn for 3 turns, or 30% HP, and turning that positive into a 0, but also adding a negative 30% over 3 turns to that equation, you're seeing a 60% HP swing from a single status. This does happen over time, and maybe they've already got a couple hits of regen, so you're only countering off 1 or 2 of them, which actually makes this even more complex. And the same can kind of be said about haste. If you're catching them on their last turn, sure, they are losing a lot of speed, but they would have lost at least some of that speed on the following turn anyways. And there's also a couple of good statuses that Ready Player will mention that also fit a different pattern, and that's confusion and sleep. The longer you're confused or asleep largely depends on whether or not you get hit by a follow-up attack. Sleep actually has an interesting wrinkle in it that sleeping characters take more damage from the attack that wakes them up. So it is at the very least a damage bonus. If you put a character to sleep, you're getting something good out of that, even in the maximally bad scenario where you wake them up right before their turn. Like, hey, it's time for you to hit me. And confusion can work the same way. It can either negate an enemy's attack while additionally potentially turning it into something that attacks one of their allies. Although, unlike Charm, they can also still attack you. They're roughly attacking whatever's closest in range with a basic attack. They don't necessarily always attack their allies. It is confusion after all. But also Charm functions under this mechanic as well. So like, Charm can hugely swing the tempo of a fight by instantly allowing you to outnumber your opponents, but you can also lose that advantage just as easily before it actually reaps its dividend. So there's a lot to be said about all 3 of those mechanics, but another one that isn't mentioned that is probably the randomest status effect that ever randomed is Paralyze. There's a number of characters that can paralyze in AoE. There's also characters like Alaya the Alabaster who can give herself an increased chance to paralyze with one of her AoE skills, I believe. There's also a lot of characters that get Paralyze on AoE effects that are independent of damage too, so it might be something that, I don't know, if you can't hit a character, instead you use a Paralyze skill. Why would it be important that a Paralyze skill hits a unit that you can't yourself hit, you might wonder? Well, because Paralyzed units can't dodge. This is actually true of a couple other status effects. I think it's either Immobilize or Disable, if not both. I think Stop also does this, and Sleep may also do this as well. There's a number of status effects that make you unable to dodge. Also, I think certain status effects may turn off your ability to counter. All of those add to the complexity and of them individually, but for Paralyze, it's even more random and less chaotic, or even more random and chaotic while not necessarily being more complex. Let's compare Paralyze to Stun, for instance. Stun has a pretty set effect. There's not a lot of complexity or randomness here beyond the initial chance to inflict stun. After that, it impacts a character for a set number of turns, usually only one. Paralyze kind of works the same way at first, but each turn that a character is paralyzed, and there's 3 of them, they have an 80% chance that they can't do anything. This means that compared to stun, they could be stunned for 3 turns. In fact, it's the most likely outcome that they will be stunned for 3 turns. At the very minimum, I would say the average is positive of 2. So it's better than the best stun in game, which I think is for 2 turns from the original Tifa on her LB, I want to say. So, would that mean that Paralysis is always better than Stun? Well, no, because the character might, for all 3 turns, not be stunned at all, not be paralyzed at all. That could happen. It's exceedingly rare, but just like with our reflex example, it can happen. And if you're really relying on the Paralyze, I mean, I guess that sucks for you. Although there is still the passive effect of them being unable to dodge, which in the right scenario you can definitely utilize to your benefit. There's another level of complexity to Paralyze itself. Let's compare it to Disable. Disable also acts for 3 turns, and it acts 100% of the time for those 3 turns. However, it does allow our enemy more mobility. It allows them to move per turn. And typically the AI will take them up on this offer, moving every turn. This is going to ultimately decrease the starting amount of CT that's going to determine how quickly they get their next turn. Whereas, if you're forced to stand still, as Paralyze does, and actually as Immobilize does, you'll actually get your next turn quicker. If I were to disable and paralyze 2 different characters at exactly the same time, I should be able to expect that in most cases, the unit that was paralyzed will get through their 3 turns and be free of the status effect faster than the character that was disabled, also being true of Immobilization. Nope, this effect breaks down for Stop because you just don't have the CT. The CT isn't happening for a set amount of time. That just happens.
Now, some status effects have some really important impact on your game that is not really documented anywhere. Now, if you want to see this in the form of a super cool table that explains everything precisely, on warthevisions.info, Meow had done a super good work of compiling all that information into a comprehensive table.
Of course, this also means that with evasion being as much of a problem as it is, there's actually a secret solution to this problem that a lot of us haven't noticed. And at first it was because early in the game the AI wasn't even capable of this. This was actually a feature that was kind of increased for the AI. Actually, this is a little bit of a rumor, right? This could have been in the game from the very beginning, except that the difference between accuracy and evasion was never really high enough that it would happen consistently enough that we noticed. But as the power creep grew the potential divide between those two things high enough, we got into a point where it started happening more often. and that is that while offensive characters will basically never use their passive skills that inflict debuffs or stuff on units that they can hit with damage, they will prioritize the damage basically every time. If they have a 0% chance of hitting them specifically, or I think a really low chance of hitting them, I'm not sure where the threshold is here, and complexity again, but they have a chance. If they have a low enough chance of being able to hit them, they will instead say, okay, well, I should see if I can disable them or something. So there are that number of status effects that I just mentioned, all of which interacting with invasion. If you have this on a particularly inaccurate character that doesn't have a guaranteed hit, then it's going to force their AI to either buff themselves or use that ability on your opponent. And especially if your opponent is magic based, which is really unfortunate for, I guess, Elena specifically, then that high faith is going to mean that maybe these statuses land more consistently. So I guess how you counter Elena in this case is have a really inaccurate unit paralyze her, disable her, stop her, etc., because then she can't dodge anybody, and she has a higher chance of this happening to her because of her 97 faith than her physical counterparts in other physical evasion units.
4 status effects increase damage taken by 50%, which is very impactful, and not everybody knows that. Berserk is one of them, Chicken if you reduce an enemy's bravery below 10, and then Sleep for the hit that wakes you up, and Toad while you're transformed. All these increase damage taken, which is pretty important. Then most status effects, when they affect you, will interrupt your current spell, being Berserked, Chickened, Charm, Confused, Disable, Paralyzed, Petrified, and you can see the rest on screen. A lot of status effects also prevent your reactions, so while you're Berserked, you will not use reaction abilities. Same for Chicken, Disable, Paralyze. Again, Silence only prevents reaction abilities that scale off magic, so not every one of them. But the others will prevent you from reacting as well. So this table here is a really good thing to know, and you should know them. Like, oh, how can I interrupt the enemy's spell? Well, you have a boatload of options to prevent their spell from going off. It's not just Jamming Thrust that can do that.
I'm Jackie Fox, and you can find me all over the internet if you click the link in the description. But also remember that the free-to-play option for YouTube is to like, subscribe, and leave a nice comment. Tell me what you think of the video, what you think about the things that we discussed in it. Tell me some stories. I want to hear the craziest reflex story that you can possibly think of in like multiple characters reflexing each other, multiple characters reflexing the same skill at the same time. All the just craziest what's the odds stories in the comments. Also in that link you can also find my main channel where I discuss the world around us. That also has an associated podcast if you just want to listen to me on your ride in the car. Also, I sell books and take donations, so if you want to check out those things, if you're into fantasy fiction, which I don't know, you might be if you're paying attention to the story of this game, or if you're into more realistic fiction, I also write that as well. Links to those books can be found in the description. But in addition to that, if you just want to throw some money to support the channel, help me buy groceries, or help me with my next set of pulls, then be sure to do that. And I think if you do it on coffee specifically, you can send me a little note with it and be like, hey, this $10 is for pulling, Fox. $10 is for pulling, and I may even film the pulls for you if you do that. I don't know. There's all sorts of ways that we could do this, but it all begins by you clicking that link in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and with all that being said, I'll see you in the next one.
Talking about... I just decided that Ayaka was a status ailment as well, so we're just going to put Ayaka up here on the... Because you know what? Ayaka, right? Oh, so hold on. Ayaka. There we go. There we go. I actually swore when I was using the beeper there.